Chany of Gen X Quilters and the author of Sister Sampler Quilts. We've put together a series of video tutorials for you on some basic quilting techniques to either help get you started or, if you're more experienced, give you a little refresher on some of the skills you might need to make your next project a real big success. I'm going to talk to you now about the Scant 1/4 inch. Have you heard this term before? A lot of people have heard about it, but don't necessarily know what it is or have never tested or tried it. It's really something you should do. There's a very simple test that you can do to test your 1/4 inch seam. We know we always sew with 1/4 inch seams in quilting, but if we've never looked at it, we don't realize what we're actually sewing. If you sew with a true 1/4 inch seam, a lot of times your blocks will end up short. Has this ever happened to you? This happened to me for years. For years I sewed and never tested my 1/4 inch seam. And everything I made was just a little bit off. It was never quite the right dimensions that it was supposed to be, and it was always a little short. That's because when you sew your pieces together, the thread and the fold of the pieces that you're sewing actually take up some space, and as a result, it makes your pieces short because that takes up extra space, and we need to adjust for that in order to get what we're sewing to be the true dimensions that you're looking for in the result of putting your two pieces together. So there's a real quick little test. It sounds a little complicated, but we can do this pretty quickly within 10 minutes or so of playing around on your machine to finding that right sweet spot where you're sewing a scant 1/4 inch. One of the hints I wanted to give you to help increase your accuracy while you're sewing is the use of a 1/4 inch foot. I don't know if you've ever used one of these, but this one right here is the 1/4 inch foot. These two show more of the standard feet that come with your machine. If you purchase a separate 1/4 inch foot for your machine, you'll see that it has this little guide here on the right hand side. And what that guide does is you butt the squares up against that guide as you're sewing, and it helps keep your pieces straight as you're feeding them under your needle. So it really helps improve your accuracy and your consistency as you're sewing. So if you're trying to make your quilt blocks more accurate, this is something that will definitely help you out. So let's see, I'll pop that on here for this little scant 1/4 inch test. There. Now, to do the test, I'm starting with just two simple little scraps. The key is that you want them to be about 1 1/4 inches wide. These are 1 1/4 by 2 1/2. It doesn't really matter how long they are. Just make sure that they are 1 1/4 inches wide. We're going to put these two right sides together. And if we sew them, we expect to see them be 2 inches wide when we're finished sewing our 1/4 inch seam. So I'll drop those in here. Now again, all I've done is just turn on my machine, so the needle is in its default position when I turn the machine on. So I'll sew those through. And there's the seam. Now we'll go ahead and press this seam real quick. Now when you're pressing and you're testing your 1/4 inch seam, you want to press and make sure you're using the method that you usually press with. Some people like to press open, others like to press their seams to the side. I like the seams to the side most of the time. But you want to make sure you use the type of pressing that you normally use because we're testing the kind of the width of the thread and the fold. So depending on which way you fold the seam, open or to the side, does make a small difference in your measurement. So just to be really precise, you want to use the method that you use for pressing most. Now, when we come over here and measure, this should be, if we started out with 1 1/4 inch wide blocks, sewed a 1/4 inch seam, it should be 2 inches wide. You can see it's a little crooked, but it's definitely shy. Okay, so this, as you go through and continually sew these seams short, will add up over the rest of your block to having a block that's probably a 1/4 inch short of the dimensions that you need. So how do we fix this? We'll take our samples again. They're the same 1/4 inch wide rectangles. And if you have a machine with an adjustable needle, like I do, you'll want to shift your needle either to the left or the right. Now, if they're coming up short, we need to make this distance in our seam allowance smaller. So if this seam allowance is smaller and has less fabric in it, then when you go and open them up, it should make the two squares reach that full 2-inch dimension. So this takes some playing around with. You know, you might try just shifting your needle 1 or 2 notches at first. I know for my machine, I need to shift it quite a bit. So this is something I've kind of played around with, and you should do on your own machine. And we'll sew those up. So I've shifted my needle to the right. I think you can visually see the difference between the seam. You know, there's a much larger amount of fabric here in your seam allowance, or that amount of fabric is smaller here since I moved my needle in this direction. So when we go and press it, it should show up as being right on 2 inches. So it's a really simple test. Of course, you probably won't shift your needle the correct amount the first time you do it, but if you play around with it a couple times, it will greatly improve your accuracy. You can see the difference between the 2-inch one that hits right on and the piece that ended up shy. Now, not all machines have adjustable needles. What should you do if you have a fixed needle on your machine? Well, instead of moving the needle to change the amount of fabric in your seam allowance, we're going to need to change where we position our squares. So it's another high-tech fix, but we just use a piece of tape. If you have too much fabric, which is usually the case in your seam allowance, we'll want to put this piece of tape just inside that guard. So normally you would line your fabric up here with the guard, and we can't shift your needle, so instead we'll have to shift your squares over. So again, this is another point where you play with this several times, and then when you're going to feed your squares through, instead of lining your squares up and feeding them in against the guard or the edge of your presser foot, you would line them up with the tape, and that will control and keep the distance or the amount of fabric in your seam allowance consistent. It's something you can do in 10 minutes, and it's one of the factors that has most greatly influenced my sewing. After I did this simple test, almost all the blocks came out much, much more consistent and accurate than they had before. So I really suggest you do this simple test, and I hope it helps you out. Thank you.